The Strait of Hormuz. It is a name that commands the immediate attention of presidents, prime ministers, military generals, and global economic leaders alike. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are embarking on a deep, comprehensive dive into the most vital, the most dangerous, and the most fiercely contested stretch of water on the entire planet. We are going to explore its ancient history, its unparalleled modern economic importance, the explosive current events shaping its waters today, and what the future holds for this geopolitical choke point. If you were to look at a map of the world and search for the absolute jugular vein of the global economy, your finger would inevitably land right here, in the Middle East, between the southern coast of Iran and the northern coast of the United Arab Emirates and the Muzandam Peninsula of Oman. This is the Strait of Hormuz. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and ultimately to the Arabian Sea and the open waters of the Indian Ocean. At its narrowest point, this strait is only about 21 miles wide. And yet, the shipping lanes that safely accommodate massive oil tankers are just 2 miles wide in either direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Through this tiny, precarious bottleneck flows the lifeblood of the modern world. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz is so critically important, we have to look at the sheer volume of energy that passes through it. We are talking about roughly 20 to 30% of the world's entire petroleum liquids consumption. Every single day, millions of barrels of crude oil, condensate, and refined petroleum products are loaded onto massive tankers in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran, and they all must pass through this narrow gap to reach markets in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. But it is not just oil. The strait is also the primary export route for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, from Qatar. Qatar is one of the top LNG exporters in the world, and nearly all of its gas exports traverse this choke point. If this strait were to be closed, or even severely restricted, the global energy market would experience a shock unlike anything we have ever seen, dwarfing previous energy crises and sending the global economy into a devastating tailspin. But the story of the Strait of Hormuz does not begin with oil. Long before the combustion engine, long before the era of supertankers and nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, this body of water was a bustling highway of trade, empire, and conquest. The history of the Strait of Hormuz is, in many ways, the history of human civilization itself. Thousands of years ago, the waters of the Persian Gulf served as a maritime link between the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia and the advanced cities of the Indus Valley. Ancient sailors navigated these waters relying on the stars, the winds, and their deep knowledge of the tides. They carried copper, timber, spices, and precious stones. The coastal regions around the strait were inhabited by seafaring peoples who mastered the harsh, arid environment, building resilient societies that thrived on trade. As the great Persian empires rose to power, the Achaemenids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids, the Strait of Hormuz became a vital strategic asset. These empires understood that whoever controlled the waters controlled the wealth of the region. Alexander the Great, during his monumental campaigns, recognized the strategic value of the Persian Gulf and sent his admiral Nearchus to explore these coastal routes, bridging the gap between his conquests in India and the heartland of his new empire. As we move into the Islamic Golden Age, the region saw an explosion of maritime commerce. Arab and Persian merchants sailed from ports like Saraf and Basra, passing through the Strait of Hormuz, crossing the Indian Ocean to reach India, Southeast Asia, and even Tang Dynasty China. They brought back silk, porcelain, spices, and technological innovations. The Kingdom of Ormus, established in the medieval period, became a legendary center of wealth and commerce. Situated strategically near the strait, it served as an emporium where goods from the east and west were exchanged. It was a cosmopolitan hub, teeming with merchants of different faiths, languages, and cultures. The famous explorer Marco Polo visited Ormus and wrote of its immense wealth, its bustling markets, and the exotic goods that flowed through its ports. But the wealth of Ormus eventually attracted the attention of a new breed of seafaring powers, the Europeans. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese Empire, driven by a desire to bypass the traditional overland trade routes controlled by the Ottoman Empire and the Venetians, sailed around the southern tip of Africa and burst into the Indian Ocean. Led by the ruthless and visionary Admiral Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese realized that to dominate the lucrative spice trade, they needed to control the strategic choke points of the Indian Ocean network. In 1507, Albuquerque fiercely attacked and conquered Ormus. For over a century, the Portuguese held the strait in an iron grip. They built formidable fortresses, controlled the shipping lanes, and extracted heavy tolls from merchants. Their dominance fundamentally altered the balance of power in the region, bringing European naval warfare and mercantilism to the Persian Gulf. However, empires rise, and empires fall. By the early 17th century, the Portuguese monopoly was challenged by the rising power of the British East India Company and the Safavid Empire of Iran. In 1622, a joint Anglo-Persian force besieged the Portuguese fortress at Ormus, ultimately driving them out. This marked a significant turning point. The British gradually established themselves as the preeminent naval power in the Persian Gulf, a position they would hold for centuries. Their primary objective was not territorial conquest, but rather the protection of their vital trade routes to India, the crown jewel of their empire. The British entered into various treaties with the local Arab sheikdoms along the coast, regions that are now part of the United Arab Emirates and Oman, creating a maritime truce that earned the region the name the Trucial States. The British Navy policed the waters, suppressing piracy and ensuring the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz. This British hegemony lasted through the 19th and into the early 20th century. But beneath the arid sands of the Middle East lay a hidden resource that was about to change the destiny of the Strait of Hormuz forever. Oil. The discovery of massive oil reserves in Persia in the early 1900s, followed by subsequent colossal discoveries in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq, fundamentally shifted global geopolitics. As the world transitioned to oil-fueled navies, automobiles, and industries, the Persian Gulf became the strategic center of gravity for the global economy. And every drop of that oil that was exported by sea had to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Following the end of the Second World War and the eventual withdrawal of British forces from the region in 1971, a power vacuum emerged. The United States, locked in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, recognized the absolute necessity of keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and preventing the region's oil from falling under Soviet influence. The U.S. adopted a policy of relying on the twin pillars of Saudi Arabia and Imperial Iran to maintain stability. The Shah of Iran, armed with massive oil revenues and advanced American military hardware, positioned himself as the policeman of the Gulf, ensuring the security of the strait. But the geopolitical landscape was shattered in 1979 by the Iranian Revolution. The fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini transformed Iran from a staunch American ally into a fierce adversary. Suddenly, the northern coast of the Strait of Hormuz was controlled by a deeply anti-Western regime. This shift sent shockwaves through global energy markets and fundamentally altered the security calculus of the region. The United States, recognizing the immense threat this posed, issued the Carter Doctrine in 1980, explicitly stating that the U.S. would use military force if necessary to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf. The volatility of the strait became horrifyingly apparent during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. This brutal, protracted conflict eventually spilled out into the waters of the Gulf in what became known as the Tanker War. Both Iran and Iraq began attacking each other's commercial oil shipments in a desperate attempt to cripple the other's economy. Unarmed oil tankers, crewed by civilians from all over the world, suddenly found themselves in a war zone. They were targeted by Exocet missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and naval mines. The attacks caused massive spikes in insurance premiums, disrupted global oil supplies, and forced international intervention. The United States Navy initiated Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II, to escort reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Strait and the Gulf. This operation brought the US and Iran into direct military confrontation. In 1988, after an American frigate, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, struck an Iranian mine, the US launched Operation Praying Mantis. In a single day of intense naval combat, American forces destroyed a significant portion of the Iranian Navy and several offshore intelligence platforms. It was a stark demonstration of American military power and a clear message that the US would not tolerate the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The tanker war eventually ended, but the underlying tensions remained. Moving into the 21st century, the Strait of Hormuz has remained a relentless geopolitical flashpoint. The dynamic has largely been defined by the escalating standoff between Iran on one side, and the United States and its regional allies on the other. Iran, vastly outgunned by the conventional military might of the United States Navy, has adopted a sophisticated doctrine of asymmetric warfare. Instead of relying on large, vulnerable warships, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, or IRGCN, utilizes a swarm tactic. They employ hundreds of small, fast, heavily armed speedboats, equipped with torpedoes, rockets, and anti-ship missiles. They possess a massive arsenal of land-based anti-ship cruise missiles hidden along the rugged, mountainous coastline of the strait. They have an extensive inventory of naval mines and a fleet of midget submarines that are incredibly difficult to detect in the shallow, noisy waters of the Gulf. Iran's strategy is not necessarily to defeat the US Navy in a conventional battle. They know that is impossible. Their strategy is deterrence and denial. They want to make the cost of intervening in the Gulf so high, and the disruption to global shipping so severe, that their adversaries will back down. Iranian leaders have repeatedly threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz if their country is attacked or if their oil exports are completely cut off by sanctions. This is not an empty threat. While keeping the strait closed permanently would be extremely difficult given the power of the US military, even a temporary closure, or the mere threat of a closure, is enough to send panic through global markets. Over the past 2 decades, we have seen a continuous cycle of escalation and de-escalation in these waters. When international sanctions against Iran's nuclear program have tightened, Iran has often responded by increasing its aggressive posture in the strait. They have conducted highly publicized military exercises, testing missiles perilously close to commercial shipping lanes. They have harassed and detained commercial vessels. They have aggressively intercepted US Navy ships, sometimes coming within a few hundred yards in highly provocative maneuvers. The economic implications of this tension are staggering. We have to look closely at the mechanics of maritime insurance to truly grasp how fragile this system is. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't necessarily need to be physically blocked by mines or sunken ships to be effectively closed to commerce. It can be closed by the insurance market. When tensions spike and the risk of conflict increases, the Joint War Committee of the London insurance market can designate the region as a high-risk zone. When this happens, the war risk premiums that shipowners must pay to insure their massively expensive tankers and their incredibly valuable cargo skyrocket. If a physical attack occurs, these premiums can surge tenfold overnight. If the risk becomes too high, marine insurers may simply refuse to offer coverage altogether. Without insurance, major shipping companies will not send their vessels into the strait. The tankers will drop anchor in the Arabian Sea, waiting for the danger to pass. The flow of oil stops entirely without a single naval blockade being formally declared. It is a terrifying vulnerability. This brings us to the present day, and the situation we are witnessing right now is arguably the most severe and complex crisis the Strait of Hormuz has faced since the 1980s. The geopolitical landscape of the mid-2020s has deteriorated into a chaotic web of interlocking conflicts. We are not just looking at a bilateral standoff between the US and Iran anymore. The entire region is inflamed. The current environment has been massively complicated by the ongoing instability in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. For years now, Houthi forces in Yemen have utilized advanced drones and ballistic missiles, supplied and supported by Iran, to attack commercial shipping. This forced a massive rerouting of global trade away from the Suez Canal and around the Cape of Good Hope, straining global supply chains and increasing shipping costs. But the Red Sea crisis has inevitably bled into the Persian Gulf. In recent times, we have seen a sharp increase in the seizure of commercial tankers by Iranian forces. The justifications vary. Sometimes Iran claims the vessels were involved in fuel smuggling, other times they cite legal disputes or environmental violations. But the underlying message is always clear. Iran controls these waters, and they can interrupt the flow of commerce whenever they choose. These seizures are often highly coordinated operations involving helicopters and fast attack craft, designed to demonstrate the reach and capability of the IRGC. Furthermore, the breakdown of diplomatic negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program has removed the guardrails that once existed. The diplomatic off-ramps are disappearing. This has led to an intense militarization of the region. The United States has surged military assets into the Middle East, deploying additional aircraft carrier strike groups, stealth fighter squadrons, and thousands of combat troops. Regional allies, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are deeply concerned about the escalating rhetoric and the very real possibility of a regional war that would devastate their economies and infrastructure. The situation has escalated to the point where aggressive interdictions and blockades are not just theoretical threats, but immediate realities. Reports of kinetic strikes, massive insurance cancellations, and naval blockades targeting vessels associated with Iranian trade are creating an unprecedented level of volatility. The global energy market is reacting exactly as one would expect, with extreme anxiety. Oil prices are hypersensitive to every headline coming out of the Gulf. A single incident, a miscalculation by a young speedboat commander, or a targeted missile strike on a maritime asset could trigger a cascading series of events that shuts down 20% of the world's energy supply. To mitigate this massive vulnerability, the nations of the Middle East have spent decades trying to find ways to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. They recognize that relying entirely on a 21-mile-wide chokepoint is a fatal flaw in their economic security. Saudi Arabia constructed the massive East-West pipeline, also known as Petroline. This incredible feat of engineering stretches completely across the Arabian Peninsula, carrying millions of barrels of oil a day from the oil fields of the eastern province to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea, entirely bypassing the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates built the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, which transports oil from its onshore fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, allowing tankers to load oil without ever entering the strait. These pipelines are critical strategic assets, but they are not a complete solution. Their combined capacity is only a fraction of the total volume of oil that flows through the strait. Furthermore, they do not address the issue of liquefied natural gas. Qatar's massive LNG exports, which are vital for the energy security of Europe and Asia, have no pipeline alternative. They must go through Hormuz. If the strait closes, the pipelines can cushion the blow, but they cannot prevent a global energy crisis. So, what does the future hold for the Strait of Hormuz? Is it destined to remain a geopolitical powder keg forever? The long-term future of the strait is intricately tied to the global energy transition. As the world slowly moves away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy sources, solar, wind, nuclear, and advanced battery technologies, the fundamental strategic value of the Middle East's oil will begin to decline. The nations that rely most heavily on oil from the Persian Gulf, particularly major Asian economies like China, India, Japan, and South Korea, are aggressively investing in green energy and domestic production specifically to reduce their vulnerability to a crisis in Hormuz. If global demand for oil peaks and then substantially decreases over the next few decades, the leverage that comes with controlling the Strait of Hormuz will also diminish. The strait will still be an important shipping lane for containerized cargo and regional trade, but it may gradually lose its status as the absolute focal point of global economic security. However, that transition is decades away. We are currently living in a prolonged transitional phase where the global economy remains desperately dependent on petroleum liquids, and the geopolitics of the Middle East remain intensely volatile. During this phase, the Strait of Hormuz will remain incredibly dangerous. We must also consider the shifting roles of global superpowers. For decades, the United States has acted as the sole guarantor of maritime security in the Persian Gulf. However, as the U.S. shifts its strategic focus toward the Indo-Pacific region and the rising challenge of China, and as domestic energy production in North America makes the U.S. less directly reliant on Middle Eastern oil, questions are being raised about the long-term commitment of the American military to the region. Will the U.S. continue to bear the immense financial and military cost of policing the strait indefinitely? If the U.S. were to slowly withdraw its protective umbrella, who would fill the vacuum? The most likely candidate is China. China is already the largest buyer of oil from the Persian Gulf, importing massive quantities from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and crucially, Iran. China has a profound national security interest in ensuring the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing has already established its first overseas military base in Djibouti, near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and has dramatically expanded its naval capabilities. It is highly probable that in the future, we will see a much more significant and assertive Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. This would fundamentally alter the geopolitical dynamic, potentially leading to a new era of great power competition directly within the confines of the Strait of Hormuz. Furthermore, the regional powers themselves are evolving. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are aggressively modernizing their militaries and asserting their own influence. They are no longer content to rely entirely on Western powers for their security. We may see a future where regional security architecture is managed more directly by the Gulf states themselves, which carries its own set of risks and complexities. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is a monument to the complex, deeply interconnected, and often fragile nature of the modern global economy. It is a place where ancient history collides with futuristic weaponry, where the wealth of nations is transported in massive steel hulls over waters patrolled by swarms of attack craft. Every time you fill up your car, every time you turn on a light powered by natural gas, you are connected to the political, military, and economic drama playing out right now in this narrow gap between the desert and the sea. Understanding the Strait of Hormuz means understanding the geopolitical forces that will define the 21st century. As long as the world runs on oil, and as long as the Middle East remains a theater of profound ideological and strategic competition, this 21-mile stretch of water will remain the most critical choke point on Earth. A crisis here is a crisis everywhere. We will continue to monitor the escalating situation closely, watching the military deployments, tracking the tanker movements, and analyzing the diplomatic fallout, because the stakes simply could not be higher. Thank you for watching this deep dive. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update on the geopolitical forces shaping our world. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next one.